No one noticed her the day she arrived at the palace gates. No drum was beaten for her. No voice announced her name. She stood quietly among many others, head lowered, hands folded, carrying nothing but fear, hunger, and a past no one cared to hear. Her name was Abeni. She had learned very early in life that silence was safer than hope. The palace of Abba Adikanal rose before her like a mountain made of stone and power. Tall pillars carved with ancient symbols guarded the entrance. The air smelled of incense, wealth, and authority. To most people, the palace represented glory and protection. To Abeni, it felt like a final test fate had placed in her path, a place where she could either disappear forever or survive by becoming invisible. As she stepped inside, the guards barely looked at her. One of them gestured sharply, pointing her toward the servants' quarters without a word. His eyes held no cruelty, only indifference, which somehow hurt more. Inside the palace walls, Abeni quickly learned her place. She was spoken to with commands, not names. She was looked through, not at. When mistakes were made, even by others, blame found its way to her. She is slow. She is clumsy. She should be grateful she is even here. Laughter followed her like a shadow. At night, when the palace slept and the torches burned low, Abeni would sit on the cold floor of the servants' quarters, knees drawn to her chest. She stared at her hands, hands that scrubbed floors, carried water, cleaned after those who never noticed her pain. Sometimes she wondered how a life could become so small. She was young, but exhaustion lived deep in her bones. Her body carried the weight of labor, but her heart carried something heavier, memories she never spoke aloud. Memories of loss, of hunger, of being unwanted. The palace had many servants, but Abeni was the one they mocked the most. "Look at her," some whispered when they thought she could not hear. Always quiet, always watching. She walks like she is hiding from the world. What they did not know was that silence had once saved her life. During the day, she worked without rest. At dawn, she fetched water from the wells. By noon, she cleaned corridors so wide they echoed with every step. At night, she washed garments woven with gold, careful not to stain what she could never afford to touch. And yet, despite everything, Abeni carried herself with a strange dignity. She never begged, she never argued, she never cried where others could see. There were moments rare, fleeting moments when she would pause while cleaning the palace halls and look at the carved walls. The stories etched into stone spoke of ancient queens, brave women, and bloodlines chosen by destiny. In those moments, something stirred inside her chest, something she could not name. But then a sharp voice would pull her back. "Abeni, move faster. Abeni, do you think this is your home? Abeni, know your place." And she would bow her head again. At meals, servants ate leftovers in silence. Abeni always waited until others were done before touching her food. Hunger was a familiar companion, one she had learned to endure without complaint. Thus still, the palace did not break her. There was a strength in her eyes that no one understood, a calmness that unsettled some of the older servants. One elderly woman once whispered, "That girl carries storms inside her," before quickly crossing herself and walking away. Abeni often dreamed. In her dreams, she stood in a wide-open place where no one shouted her name in anger. She dreamed of warmth that did not come from fire, and voices that spoke her name with kindness. But every morning, reality returned swiftly, and she rose before the sun, just another servant in a palace that did not care. One evening, as the sky darkened and drums echoed faintly from a distant celebration, Abeni was sent to clean a rarely used corridor near the inner chambers. The air there felt different, colder, heavier. The torches flickered as she passed, and for a brief moment she felt as if the walls themselves were watching her. She paused. A strange sensation washed over her, like a whisper brushing her soul. She shook her head and continued working, unaware that this corridor held secrets older than the palace itself, unaware that her presence there was not an accident. That night, as she lay on the hard floor, sleep did not come easily. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts restless. For the first time in years, fear mixed with something unfamiliar, anticipation. Somewhere deep within the palace, a truth lay buried, a truth tied to her blood, a truth that would shake the walls that mocked her. But for now, she was still Abeni the servant, still unseen, still underestimated. And no one, least of all those who laughed at her, could imagine that the girl they ordered around would one day stand where queens stood. The question was not if her life would change. The question was, what terrible truth was waiting to be uncovered, and what price would she have to pay when it was? Long before Ebony stood at the gates of the palace, before she learned how to lower her eyes and quiet her voice, her life had already been shaped by loss. She was born in a small village at the edge of the forest, a place where red earth stained bare feet and stories were passed from elders to children beneath the open sky. The village was poor, but it was not without warmth. People shared what little they had, and nights were filled with the sound of laughter, drums, and distant songs carried by the wind. Ebony's earliest memories were of her mother. Her mother Moreo was a woman of gentle strength. She sold palm oil and woven mats at the market, waking before dawn each day to prepare her goods. Though their hut was small and often leaked during the rains, Moreo kept it clean and filled with quiet love. She spoke to Ebony softly, as if every word mattered. "Stand straight," her mother would say, placing a hand on Ebony's back. "Even when the world bends you, do not bend your spirit." Ebony never knew her father. When she asked about him as a child, Moreo's eyes would darken, and she would change the subject. There were whispers in the village, half-spoken stories that stopped when Ebony walked by. Some said her father had been a traveler. Others said he was someone important. No one ever spoke clearly, and Moreo never corrected them. As Ebony grew older, she learned not to ask. Life in the village was not easy, but it was familiar. Children fetched water together, women cooked over open fires, and elders gathered beneath the ancient Iroko tree to settle disputes and tell stories of the past. Rituals marked the seasons, harvest festivals, naming ceremonies, and nights when the ancestors were honored with prayers and offerings. Moreo always made sure Ebony attended these gatherings. "Remember where you come from," she would say. "A person without roots is easily lost." But fate had little patience for roots. One year, a sickness swept through the village. It came quietly at first: fevers, coughs, weakness. People tried herbs and prayers, but the sickness did not listen. One by one, huts fell silent. Moreo grew ill when Ebony was still young. Ebony remembered sitting beside her mother, holding her hand as it grew colder. Moreo tried to speak, her lips trembling, her breath shallow. She looked at Ebony with eyes full of pain and love, as if trying to say everything she had never said before. "Whatever happens," Moreo whispered, "do not let bitterness live in your heart." Those were her last words. After her mother's death, the world changed. Some villagers showed kindness at first. Ebony was taken in by a distant relative, a woman already struggling to feed her own children. As months passed, kindness turned into burden. Ebony worked from morning until night fetching. Water, cleaning, cooking, always reminded that she was eating food she had not earned. "You should be grateful," the woman often said. "Without us, you would be nothing." Children mocked her for her quiet nature and her worn clothes. Elders looked at her with pity but did nothing. Slowly, Ebony learned what it meant to be unwanted. When drought came and food grew scarce, the decision was made for her. "She is not our blood," someone said. "We cannot carry everyone," another agreed. One morning, Ebony was told to leave. No ceremony, no farewell. Just a small bundle of clothes and a path leading away from the village she once called home. She walked for days, surviving on kindness that came and went. Some people offered food. Others shut their doors. She slept under trees, listening to the sounds of animals and wondering if this was how her life would end. Eventually she found work in another village, then another. Each place was the same. She was useful, never valued. Safe, but never protected. Yet even in hardship, something inside Ebony refused to die. At night she would stare at the stars and whisper dreams she did not fully understand. Dreams of belonging. Dreams of a place where she was more than a burden. There were moments, small, almost invisible moments, when elders would look at her strangely. One old man once stopped her as she passed. "You walk like someone carrying a secret," he said softly. Ebony said nothing and continued on her way, but his words stayed with her. As years passed, rumors began to follow her. Some said she brought bad luck. Others said she was cursed. People feared what they could not understand, and Ebony learned again to stay quiet, to keep her head down. It was during one of the harshest seasons that her path crossed with fate again. A traveling trader came through the village where she was working, spoke of the royal palace of servants needed, of food guaranteed, of shelter within strong walls. "The work is hard," he warned, "but you will not starve." For Abeni, the choice was simple. She had nothing left to lose. The elders gathered to discuss it, murmuring among themselves. Some saw relief in sending her away. Others felt a strange unease, as if they were pushing something important out of their lives without understanding why. Before she left, one old woman took Abeni's hand. "You are walking toward something," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I do not know if it is joy or sorrow, but it is not small." Abeni nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she walked toward the road that would lead her to the palace, a feeling settled in her chest, heavy, unavoidable. Something was coming, not yet revealed, not yet understood, but waiting. And as the palace walls rose in the distance, Abeni could not know that her life was approaching the edge of a truth so powerful. It would change not only her fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever looked down on her. The morning Abeni was taken away from her village, the drums did not beat. That silence hurt her more than chains ever could. The elders stood under the old baobab tree, their faces carved with years and secrets. No one looked directly at her. Some stared at the ground. Others watched from a distance, pretending not to see the girl who had swept their courtyard since childhood. Abeni carried nothing but a small cloth bundle and a heart heavy with questions. No one explained why she was chosen. Only one elder spoke, his voice dry like harmattan wind. "The palace needs servants. She is strong enough." Strong enough. It was all she was allowed to be. The journey to the palace was long. Dust clung to her skin. The sun followed her like an unblinking eye. Each step away from the village felt like a quiet burial of the life she knew. When the palace finally appeared, rising from stone and history, Abeni felt smaller than she ever had before. The gates were massive, carved with symbols of lions, ancestors, and victories she had only heard of in stories. As they opened, a shadow fell over her face. The gate closed behind her, and with it, the last sound of freedom. Inside the palace, life moved differently. People walked with purpose. Servants moved quickly, heads lowered. Guards stood still like statues carved from discipline. Abeni was not welcomed. She was measured. An older palace woman threw a faded servant cloth at her feet. "Wear this," she said. "You belong to the ground now." The cloth was rough. It scratched her skin, but Abeni did not react. She had learned long ago that pain noticed becomes pain repeated. From that day, her world shrank into labor. She rose before the sky changed color. She fetched water from heavy clay pots. She scrubbed stone floors that never seemed clean enough. She cleaned chambers she was not allowed to look at. Food came late, sometimes not at all. Names were shouted, orders were barked, mistakes were punished loudly. Abeni learned the palace language quickly. Silence meant safety. Eyes down meant survival. Other servants noticed her endurance. Some admired it quietly. Others resented it. When punishments came, they stepped back, letting her stand alone. "She is used to suffering," someone whispered once. "Let her take it," and she did. One afternoon, during preparations for an ancestral offering, Abeni was sent to clean a sacred inner chamber. The air inside smelled of old incense and history. Symbols were carved deep into the walls, stories of kings, bloodlines, and forgotten heirs. She moved carefully. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Footsteps entered behind her. Two palace officials stood watching. "She should not be here," one said coldly. Before Abeni could explain, one of them struck the ceremonial bowl from the altar. It shattered on the floor, its sound echoing like thunder in a dry land. The blame was decided before words were spoken. Abeni was dragged outside into the open courtyard. The sun stood high, cruel and unforgiving. "She has dishonored the ancestors," a voice announced. "She will kneel." She knelt. Hours passed. The ground burned her knees. Her mouth dried. Sweat blurred her vision. Servants passed by, some watching with pity, some with quiet satisfaction. Abeni did not cry. Inside her chest, something hardened, not into hatred but into awareness. She understood now. The palace did not care about truth. It cared about control. When darkness finally fell, her body collapsed. No healer came. No elder questioned the punishment. She was left where she fell. Fever followed. Her body shook through the night. Dreams came and went, visions of the baobab tree. Her mother's voice, whispers she could not understand. When she woke days later, thinner and weaker, another punishment waited. She was assigned to Madame Cagnen. Everyone feared that name. Madame Cagnen ruled the servants with sharp eyes and sharper words. Discipline was her pride. Cruelty was her habit. She looked at Abeni once and smiled not kindly. "You have quiet eyes," she said. "Quiet girls break easily." From that day, Abeni's suffering deepened. Her workload doubled. Her rest disappeared. Small mistakes became public humiliations. Food was taken away as correction. Her body weakened. But something else grew. She began to observe. She listened. She noticed how elders spoke carefully around certain names. She noticed which guards bowed deeper and which corridors were avoided at night, sometimes while cleaning near restricted areas. She heard hushed voices speaking of ancient blood, lost daughters, and prophecies meant to stay buried. She did not understand the words, but her heart reacted. At night, lying on the cold floor of the servant quarters, pain pulsing through her bones, Abeni stared into darkness and thought of the village she left behind. She realized something quietly. Her suffering was not random. Palace had not taken her by accident. And though she did not yet know why, Abeni made a silent decision that night. She would endure. She would remember. She would survive long enough to understand the truth. The palace believed it had broken a servant. It did not know it had awakened a destiny. The palace did not welcome Abeni. It swallowed her. Every morning as she walked through its stone corridors, she felt as though the walls themselves were watching her. They were old walls, older than memory. It's with stories of kings, wars, bloodlines, and power passed from one generation to another. Abeni was not part of those stories. At least that was what everyone believed. The palace had its own rhythm. The day began with the sound of horns announcing the rising sun. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to draw attention. Nobles walked slowly, confidently, their robes heavy with authority. Hierarchy ruled everything. There were servants who served food, servants who cleaned floors, servants who were never allowed to lift their eyes. Abeni was placed among the lowest. Her duties kept her close to the ground, scrubbing stone steps, polishing wooden doors, carrying water jars that cut into her palms. She was invisible, and that invisibility became her shield. The palace guards rarely noticed her. The nobles never addressed her. When elders passed by, their conversations stopped until she was gone. But Abeni noticed everything. She noticed how servants stiffened when certain names were spoken. She noticed how some doors were never cleaned, as if even dust was forbidden to touch them. She noticed the way the palace quieted at sunset, as though holding its breath. And she noticed one thing more than anything else. The palace avoided her eyes. At first she thought it was disgust, then fear, then something harder to name. One afternoon, while cleaning near the eastern corridor passage, servants were warned not to linger. Abeni felt a strange pull. The air there felt heavier, cooler. Symbols carved into the walls caught her attention, spirals, crowns, and a single recurring mark she had never seen before. She reached out, her fingers brushing the stone. A voice stopped her. "Not touch what remembers." Abeni turned quickly. An old palace guard stood behind her. His hair was gray, his posture bent, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone nearing the end of duty. "I am sorry," Abeni said softly, lowering her head. The guard studied her face longer than necessary. "You should not be here," he said. "But you are." His words confused her. Before she could speak, he walked away, leaving her with a feeling she could not shake. That night, Abeni dreamed. She stood in a large courtyard filled with people dressed in white. Drums beat slowly. Elders chanted names she could not understand. At the center stood a woman holding a child wrapped in royal cloth. When Abeni stepped closer, the woman turned. Her face was hidden. Abeni woke with her heart racing. Days passed. Weeks followed. Madame Cagnen continued her cruelty, but something changed. Small things at first. Punishments stopped before they became severe. Food returned to Ebony's bowl more often than before. Guards who once shoved her aside now stepped back. No one explained why. One morning, Ebony was assigned to clean a chamber near the inner palace. A place servants rarely entered. The room smelled of incense and old wood. Sunlight filtered through high windows, touching the floor like gentle fingers. At the far end stood an elderly woman seated on a carved stool. She wore simple clothing, but her presence filled the room. Ebony froze. "You may continue," the woman said calmly. Ebony worked quietly, her movements respectful. She felt the woman's gaze on her, steady and curious. "You walk like someone carrying weight," the woman said after a long silence. Ebony did not answer. "Most servants rush," the woman continued. "They fear mistakes. You do not." "I have learned patience," Ebony replied softly. The woman smiled faintly. "Patience is taught by suffering." When Ebony finished, she bowed and turned to leave. "Child," the woman said, "what is your name?" "Ebony." The woman repeated it slowly, as if tasting the sound. "Do you know what it means?" Ebony shook her head. "It means we asked for her and she came." Ebony felt a strange warmth rise in her chest. The woman dismissed her gently. As Ebony left, she felt something shift not outside, but within herself. From that day, small signs followed her. She was reassigned closer to the inner palace. Elders watched her from a distance. Servants whispered behind her back, not with cruelty, but with confusion. Why her? Why now? Who is she really? Ebony did not ask questions. She remembered her promise. Endure, observe, survive. One evening, as she carried water past the ancestral hall, she heard chanting inside. The doors were slightly open. Against her better judgment, she paused. An elder spoke. "The past cannot remain buried forever," he said. Another replied, "If the truth rises, it will shake the throne." Ebony's breath caught. She stepped back quietly, her heart pounding. That night, the dream returned. This time, the woman in white removed her veil. She had Ebony's eyes. Ebony woke trembling. The palace had not yet revealed its secrets, but it was no longer hiding them well. Something ancient was stirring, and Ebony stood closer to it than anyone realized. Days passed in the palace, and yet Ebony felt as though time itself was holding its breath. She moved through her chores with quiet precision, the weight of unspoken eyes on her, never leaving her. There was a tension now in the corridors, subtle but undeniable. Even the nobles, usually oblivious to a servant's presence, glanced at her with faint curiosity. Whispers followed her steps like shadows. Ebony had learned to notice small things, the way a guard's hand lingered on a carved doorway, or how an elder would pause mid-sentence when mentioning the ancestral line. She did not yet understand the meaning, but something deep inside stirred. A memory she could not place, a longing she could not name, called her to attention. One evening, while cleaning the inner courtyard near the ancestral hall, Ebony saw a small, worn envelope tucked behind a stone column. Its paper was delicate, yellowed with age, marked with a strange emblem, a crown surrounded by spirals she had often seen in the palace carvings. She hesitated. Every rule of the palace warned against touching unknown objects. But curiosity overcame caution. She picked it up, feeling the brittle edges and the strange heat that seemed to radiate from it. Inside was a letter written in careful, flowing script. She recognized her own name, Ebony, before the words could fully sink in. "The child who was taken shall rise. Her blood carries the legacy of kings. Watch the signs. Protect her, but do not reveal too soon." Ebony's heart raced. Her blood, legacy king. The words seemed impossible. She pressed the paper to her chest, unable to speak. Questions swirled in her mind. Who had written this? Who knew her? Why was it hidden here, in the heart of the palace? That night she could not sleep. She lay on the cold floor of her quarters, staring at the rough ceiling, listening to the whispers of other servants. Every creak of the palace seemed louder now, every shadow deeper. Her life as a servant suddenly felt incomplete, as though the walls themselves were hiding truths meant only for her eyes. Days later, more signs appeared. A pendant, once worn by the Queen Mother, was carelessly left in the corridor where Ebony often walked. She recognized the same emblem from the letter. The palace's secrets were slowly revealing themselves, and yet the full truth remained just beyond her reach. One night, a mysterious figure appeared at the edge of the courtyard, cloaked in a dark robe, with only a faint glimpse of a lined face visible beneath the hood. The figure spoke without moving closer. "You are not what they believe you to be," the voice whispered, "but you must be patient. The moment is coming." Ebony's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "You will know when the time is right. Till then, observe and survive." Then the figure vanished, leaving only the faint scent of incense and old wood. From that night onward, Ebony noticed subtle changes in the palace. Certain doors seemed to open more easily for her. Guards hesitated before reprimanding her. Even Madame Canyon, usually relentless, seemed to regard her with unspoken curiosity. It was as if the palace itself had begun to recognize her presence, acknowledging a hidden authority she could not yet claim.
Ow!
The whispers in the corridors became louder, though still cautious. Servants speculated. Elders exchanged secret glances. Ebony listened, piecing together fragments of conversations. Lost daughters, hidden heirs, forbidden rituals, ancient prophecies. Each word, each glance, nudged her closer to the realization that her life in the palace was not by chance. One evening, she was tasked with cleaning the royal library, a chamber rarely visited by anyone but the king's most trusted advisors. The shelves were lined with dusty scrolls, old books, and carved wooden boxes filled with documents. As she moved through the aisles, a single scroll fell at her feet. She opened it carefully. Symbols, names, and dates were written in a mixture of old dialects and simple script. But one name stood out: Ebony, her own name. Her heart thumped in her chest as she read words she could not fully understand, but which carried undeniable significance. "You are marked," the scroll seemed to whisper. Sudden noise made her jump. Oh, a palace guard stood at the doorway, eyes narrowed. She froze. But the guard simply nodded toward the exit and left. No punishment, no question. Just a silent acknowledgement. That night, dreams returned, stronger and more vivid than before. She walked through a lush forest where the trees spoke in hushed tones, telling her stories of queens, lost heirs, and spirits watching from the riverbanks. A figure approached an older woman with eyes that mirrored her own. "You carry what was taken from you," the woman said. "You must learn the palace, the people, the rules. Only then will you claim what is yours." Ebony awoke with tears in her eyes. The weight of her destiny pressed on her, mingled with the memory of her suffering, the humiliation and the loneliness she had endured. Every trial, every punishment, every whispered insult had prepared her for this moment. Oh. She did not yet understand the full picture, but the threads were weaving together in ways she could not ignore. The palace became both prison and teacher. Every chore, every whispered conversation, every hidden glance offered her lessons. She learned which nobles could be trusted, which elders plotted in shadows, and which guards would follow orders without question. Every piece of information, every observation, slowly built the foundation she would one day need. Then one evening, she found herself in the grand hall, where the king held council. She had been delivering water and cleaning the floors as usual, but tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with incense and power. She noticed a hidden compartment near the throne. Inside lay a carved box, sealed with wax bearing the same spiral crown emblem. Instinctively, she knew this object was connected to her in ways she could not yet explain. Before she could examine further, a royal advisor entered. His eyes met hers, sharp and calculating. He seemed to recognize something in her that no one else had. "Child," he said softly, "the palace is changing. Be ready. Observe, learn, and remember." And just like that, he left, leaving Ebony with a sense of both anticipation and unease. Her nights were filled with restless dreams, her days with careful observation. Every footstep echoed like a drumbeat of destiny. The palace was revealing its secrets, and Ebony felt herself standing on the edge of something monumental. A revelation awaited her, one that would shake the foundations of power, blood, and heritage within these ancient walls. She did not yet know what it was. She only knew it was coming in, that when it arrived, her life would never be the same. The palace had seen many seasons of power, but it had never felt this restless. That morning, The air carried an unusual weight. Even before the drums announced the sunrise, Abini sensed that something was different. The servants moved more quietly than usual. Guards spoke in low voices. Doors closed more gently, as if the walls themselves were listening. Abeni rose from her sleeping mat and stood still for a moment. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with awareness. The palace no longer felt like a place she merely survived in. It felt like a place watching her closely. She walked through the corridors to begin her work. Eyes followed her openly. No mocking smiles, no sharp laughter. Even Madame Kanyan, who had once found pleasure in her suffering, watched her with narrowed eyes and said nothing. Before the sun reached its highest point, a quiet message arrived. A young attendant approached her, careful with his words. "You are required in the council hall," he said, "near the eastern pillars. Speak only if spoken to." Abeni did not ask why. She followed. The council hall was wide and solemn, filled with the scent of incense and old authority. Elders sat in a half-circle, their faces lined with years of judgment and secrets. The king was not yet present, but his absence felt intentional, as though he waited for something to surface on its own. Abeni stood where she was told, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. For a long time, no one spoke. Then an elder cleared his throat. "There are matters that have refused to remain buried," he said slowly. "The ancestors have begun to stir." Another elder nodded. "The signs have returned. Dreams spoken in whispers, symbols appearing where they should not. A name remembered." Abeni's chest tightened. A scroll was brought forward, old and fragile, sealed with a familiar spiral crown mark. When it was opened, the hall grew still. "The child born during the season of betrayal was not lost," the elder read. "She was hidden so the bloodline might survive." A low murmur spread through the hall. "The mark has appeared again," another elder added, "and so has the name." He raised his eyes. "Abeni." The sound of her name echoed like a drumbeat. Slowly, Abeni lifted her head. Gasps filled the room. Madame Kanyan's face drained of color. A guard shifted uneasily. Several elders leaned forward, studying Abeni's face as though memory itself had been awakened. "She carries the eyes," one whispered. The stillness, another said. The presence voices rose. "She is only a servant. Or she was made one so we would never recognize her. This truth will break the old balance." Abeni felt her legs weaken, but she did not fall. Memories flooded her mind. Hunger, cold nights, cruel words, silent endurance. Every hardship suddenly carried a meaning she had never known. Then the doors of the hall opened. The king entered. He did not speak at first. His gaze found Abeni instantly, and his steps slowed. When he stood before her, his breath caught, as though something long forgotten had returned. "Look at me," he said softly. Abeni raised her eyes. For a long moment neither spoke. "She has her mother's eyes," the king whispered. "I was told the child was gone." "I lived," Abeni said quietly, "and I endured." Silence fell over the hall. The truth settled heavily like dust after a long storm, yet not all accepted it. One noble stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Blood alone does not make a ruler. She has no training, no preparation." Abeni stepped forward once. "I was trained by suffering," she said. "Prepared by silence." Her voice was calm, unshaken. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. The king studied her carefully. "The truth has begun to rise," he said at last. "It will not be rushed, nor will it be denied." He turned to Abeni. "You will remain within the palace, under protection, watched, tested." Abeni bowed her head. She was escorted from the hall not as a servant, not yet as royalty, but as something dangerous to the old order. That night, the palace did not sleep, and neither did Abeni. She finally knew who she was. But becoming it would require strength greater than blood. The palace did not announce Abeni's rise. It felt it. The change moved through the corridors like a quiet wind, unseen but undeniable. Servants no longer stepped past her as though she were invisible. Guards who once barked orders now lowered their voices when she approached. The palace had begun to adjust itself around her presence, slowly, cautiously. Abeni noticed the difference, but she did not allow it to alter her steps. She still woke before dawn. She still worked with her hands. She still listened more than she spoke. But the way she carried herself had changed. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes steadier. Silence no longer felt like weakness. It felt like control. Madame Canyon avoided her. Where once she had found fault in every movement, now she found excuses to send others instead. The cruelty that had once ruled her tongue had retreated into unease. Power was shifting, and she felt it. The elders watched from a distance. Some studied Abeni with curiosity, others with concern, a few with quiet respect. They spoke of her in careful tones, weighing each word as though it might tip the balance of the kingdom. Abeni was no longer a servant in their eyes, but she was not yet a queen. One afternoon, the king summoned her privately. The chamber was simple, far from the grand halls. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, touching the floor like memory. The king stood near a carved table, his back turned when she entered. "You walk differently now," he said without turning. "I walk as I always have," Abeni replied. The king turned slowly. "Before you survived. Now you stand." He gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, then obeyed. "For years," the king said, "this palace has been ruled by fear. Fear of losing power, fear of old wounds reopening. You carry those wounds." Abeni lowered her gaze. "I carry more than that." He nodded. "I know. From that day, small responsibilities were placed upon her. Nothing announced, nothing public. She was asked to listen to disputes among servants, to observe council sessions from behind screens, to learn the customs not from books but from people. She learned quickly. She listened when others argued. She remembered names, faces, stories, noticed who spoke truth and who hid it behind politeness. The palace began to rely on her calm presence, even if few admitted it aloud. Servants started seeking her quietly. A woman accused unfairly of theft, a young guard punished for obeying the wrong order, an elder's messenger afraid to speak. Abeni did not judge loudly. She listened. And when she spoke, people listened back. The whispers changed. It's not mockery anymore. Respect. "Have you noticed how she speaks? She does not raise her voice. She makes people feel seen." One evening, a conflict erupted between two noble families, their anger threatening to spill into violence. The king watched silently as elders argued without resolution. Then he turned to Abeni. "What do you see?" he asked. Abeni stepped forward, her voice calm. "They are afraid of losing honor," she said. "A fear makes people forget wisdom." Silence followed. Her words did not accuse. They revealed. The families listened. The conflict softened. That night, the king called her by a new title, child of the house, not queen, but no longer servant. Madame Canyon left the palace soon after. No punishment. She simply vanished, her power drained by time and truth. Abeni felt no triumph in this, only release. She walked the palace gardens alone one evening, the moonlight touching the paths she once scrubbed on her knees. No, she remembered the girl she had been hungry, silent, afraid. She honored her. The elders gathered again days later, not in argument, but in reflection. "The people are changing," one said. "They already see her," another admitted. The king said nothing. He watched Abeni from across the courtyard as she spoke with servants and guards alike, her presence steady, her dignity unforced. She did not demand respect. She earned it. That night, as drums echoed softly beyond the palace walls, Abeni stood alone beneath the stars. She was no longer the girl they mocked. She was becoming something greater. And the kingdom was beginning to understand that her rise was not built on blood alone, but on endurance, wisdom, and quiet strength. The truth did not arrive like thunder. It came like a deep breath the palace had been holding for years. The elders gathered at dawn, their robes heavy, their faces solemn. Word had already spread beyond the palace walls. The market was quieter than usual. Villagers stood in small groups, whispering, waiting. Even those who did not understand the details felt that something final was about to happen. Abeni stood alone in her chamber. She was calm, not because she lacked fear, but because she had already faced worse. Hunger, humiliation, silence. Whatever awaited her now could not undo the strength carved into her soul. When the summons came, it was not for the council hall, it was for the great courtyard. It's a place where kings were crowned, where judgments were declared, where truth could no longer hide. The king stood at the center, flanked by elders. Guards lined the walls, their expressions unreadable. Servants and nobles filled the outer edges, careful not to speak. Abeni walked forward slowly. Each step echoed. The king raised his hand. Today, he said, the kingdom listens. An elder stepped forward holding a carved box. The seal was broken. Inside lay the final pieces, records, symbols, testimonies guarded for generations. The child was hidden to save the crown, the elder said. But silence became its own injustice. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Another elder spoke. The mark. The bloodline. The witness. An old woman was brought forward, bent with age, her eyes sharp with memory. She bowed deeply before the king. I carried the child, she said, on a night without moon. I was told to disappear. Her voice shook but did not break. I gave her a name and left her where suffering would hide her better than guards. The courtyard was silent. Abeni felt tears rise, but she held them back. The king stepped toward her. Kneel, he said softly. Abeni did. He removed a small symbol from his robe, the spiral crown, worn only by those born to rule. This does not erase what you endured, he said. Nothing can. He placed it gently in her hands. But it honors what you became. Gasps spread. Some nobles lowered their heads. Others stared in disbelief. One voice broke the silence. A noble who had opposed her from the beginning stepped forward, anger trembling beneath his words. She has suffered, yes, he said. But does pain make a ruler? Abeni stood before the king could answer. No, she said calmly. It makes a witness. She turned to the crowd. I do not stand here to claim revenge, she said. I stand to end silence, her voice carried. The palace failed me. The village failed me. But I learned from both. She looked at the noble who had spoken. Power, without listening, creates fear. Fear creates cruelty. The elder lowered his eyes. The king nodded. No punishment will be born of hatred today, he declared. Only truth. Those who had plotted were stripped of influence, not dignity. Those who had remained silent were given a chance to speak. Justice moved carefully, humanely. The king turned to Abeni one final time. Do you accept this path? He asked. Not as comfort, but as duty. Abeni looked around the courtyard. The servants, the villagers, the elders, the guards. She thought of the girl she had been. I accept, she said. For them, the drums began, slow, steady, not celebration. Recognition. The palace did not cheer, it bowed. The palace did not change overnight, but the air within it did. In the days that followed the revelation, silence returned, not the cruel silence that once ignored suffering, but a thoughtful one. Decisions were slower, voices softer. Even footsteps echoed with care. Abeni did not move into the grandest chamber. She chose a modest room overlooking the old baobab tree in the courtyard. From her window, she could see servants resting in the shade. Guards speaking quietly, elders walking slowly with their staffs. She wanted to remember where she came from. Every morning, she walked through the palace without announcement. She greeted cooks by name. She listened to guards who had never been asked their thoughts. She sat with village women who came seeking justice and let them speak until their voices steadied. She did not rule with distance. She ruled with presence. The people noticed. The servants who once lowered their eyes now met her gaze. Children stopped whispering and began dreaming. Elders spoke of balance returning not because a crown had changed hands, but because a heart shaped by hardship now guided it. When disputes arose, Abeni did not shout. She asked questions. When anger filled the council, she waited. Her strength was not loud, it was steady. One evening, she returned to the village where she had grown up. The houses were smaller than she remembered, but the pain felt lighter. An old neighbor recognized her and began to cry not from shame, but relief. "You survived," the woman said. Benny held her hands. "We survived," she replied. She ordered that no child would be forced into silence again, that no servant would be invisible. The truth would never be buried to protect power. Not all wounds healed. Some never do, but they stopped bleeding. And that was enough to begin. Years later, storytellers would speak of her not as the queen who rose from servitude, but as the ruler who listened when others turned away. They would say the palace learned humility, that the village learned hope, that suffering, when witnessed and honored, can become wisdom. On quiet nights, Ebony would sit beneath the baobab tree and think of the girl she once was. Small, afraid, unnoticed, not mourner. She thanked her, because without her endurance there would have been no compassion. Without her silence, no understanding of voices unheard. The kingdom did not remember her for the crown she wore. It remembered her for the peace she left behind. And so, the story did not end with power. It ended with balance. With a lesson passed from elder to child, from mother to daughter, never mock the quiet ones. Never dismiss the forgotten. For sometimes, the one who carries the deepest scars is the one destined to heal us all.